The idea that there isn't sufficient demand for credit in the longer term means that businesses lack the confidence to invest. That's what it means. If you had a lender strike, which is to say the US Treasury gave a Treasury auction and nobody showed up, and the Treasury had to buy the whole issue, then I think that you would have the same crisis in confidence that existed in 2008. And I think a recession is a logical outcome. Inflation is all about quantitative easing, which is to say counterfeiting. It's all about negative real interest rates. The level of interest rate, as we learned in the 1970s, is less important than the real interest rate, which is to say the interest rate on the 10-year Treasury minus the increase in the consumer price index. And I don't see the United States government having the willingness to deal with the underlying causes of inflation, which is to say we're consuming more than we're producing. We're subsidizing that with counterfeiting, they would call it quantitative easing, and with negative real interest rates. We're also causing it to occur with debt and deficits. We're forward shifting the liability for our high apparent standard of living by assigning the bills to our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. There seems to be a fondness among voters to inflict poverty on subsequent generations rather than alter their own living standards. And that's extremely popular. So I think that the underlying cause of inflation isn't so much to do with, as an example, the increase in energy or food costs as a consequence of the war. But I think there are much stronger underlying causes of inflation, including primarily quantitative easing, debt and deficits, and the most pernicious of all, negative real interest rates. Between 35 and 40% of all the US dollars in circulation have been created in the last 30 months.
Wow.
Now,
Yeah.
was that done to accommodate an economy that's now 30 or 40% larger? Of course not. It has nothing to do with stock to float. It has everything to do with the fact that we voted ourselves a bunch of benefits and neglected to pay for them. And the only way that we could pay for them was to create specious currency units. The idea that there isn't sufficient demand for credit in the longer term means that businesses lack the confidence to invest. That's what it means. And business intention, commercial intention, is often a very good indicator of recessions. I believe that the economy that we're existing in today is buoyant partly as a function of artificially low interest rates, partly as a function of the fact that savers and voters seem not to care too much about quantitative easing or about debt and deficits. If you had a lender strike, which is to say the US Treasury gave a Treasury auction and nobody showed up, and the Treasury had to buy the whole issue, then I think that you would have the same crisis in confidence that existed in 2008. And I think a recession is a logical outcome. Your government, the US government, suggests that the current inflation rate is somewhere between 6.5% and 7.5%, depending on which agency you ask. And the US 10-year Treasury is yielding about let's call it 2, just to make the math simple. What that means is that if the pricing of the US 10-year Treasury were to return to mean and have a positive yield, it would have to yield about 7. Now, think of the impact on federal, state, and local budgets if the interest charge tripled or quadrupled. I do think that a default winner is gold. It is one of the only, if not the only, financial asset that is both a medium of exchange, which is to say a money, but also an asset in and of itself rather than being a promise to pay. The renminbi, the dollar, the ruble are all really, in the end, promises to pay. But gold is in effect payment in and of itself. So I do believe that gold's prominence as a medium of exchange will increase as a consequence of unstable geopolitics and increased too inadvertently because of the U.S. government's decision to weaponize the U.S. dollar and weaponize the SWIFT system. We've used the dollar's preeminence around the world. I say we advisedly. You and I both carry American passports. Our government has decided to weaponize our currency and our payments mechanism, taking advantage of the fact that the world is on a dollar standard to attempt to enforce American policy extraterritorially. Whether or not you agree with the direction of U.S. policy, I think there is no doubt that there are a lot of countries and a lot of people around the world that don't appreciate the extraterritorial nature of U.S. policy. A gold standard is always a limit to a political system's power and a politician's power. So if you are a politician, the idea that your fiscal policy should be held hostage to gold, or that your ability to issue specious currency should be held hostage to gold, is to you a circumstance to be avoided at all cost. The idea, as an example, that Mr. Putin, were he on a gold standard, would be unable to affect fiscal policy in rubles, but rather would be tied to the flow of gold. I mean, I don't see any reason why you and I couldn't be on our own gold standard and measure our purchases and sales in gold and do transactions between ourselves in gold. I think that the distributed ledger technology, the blockchain technology, is coming along very quickly, which will allow the tokenization of gold and the utilization of gold in small transactions and large. And I think that large transactions, as an example, by and between, say, Russia and India, or China and Indonesia, will become increasingly denominated in gold. But I don't think that you will see any fiat currency in the world tied to a gold standard simply because it limits the power of the political class. I could see gold as part of a basket of assets, but the purpose of gold is sound money, and the concept of sound money and the concept of a powerful state are in direct opposition to each other. Reserve currencies that are made up of a basket of fiat currencies, so that a supranational organization like the World Bank or the United Nations could do the same type of fiscal policy and frankly the same type of counterfeiting that exists on an individual ad hoc basis today, might find real favor with the political class. It would give them another level of obfuscation, another way to divorce their power from what is good for you as an individual.